Hello everyone. So I am still slowly working my way through the list of questions that I had sort of collected off of social media at this point, probably almost a year ago. And of course, I also have new questions that are coming in as comments on the different posts. I'm trying to get to those as well. I know I have a couple sort of pending now, if you will. But today I wanted to try to do what will hopefully be a fairly short video addressing the question of basically fairy etiquette. And I want to preface this right at the beginning by saying when we're looking at fairy etiquette, you kind of have to understand right off the bat that it's going to be very regionally specific, culturally specific, area specific. It depends a lot on exactly what beings you're dealing with, what folklore you're looking at, and this can really vary. So the specific etiquette that I'm talking about today, that I'm going to describe today, is based on primarily Irish and Scottish fairy lore, and I suppose you could say more broadly Celtic language speaking fairy lore. And aspects of this would also apply to a degree to the Norse, although they're sort of like close cousins to the Celtic language speaking fairy material. They have a lot of similarities, but they do have some differences. So I recommend, just taking this in that context, that it is specific to those areas and to those language-speaking cultures, and this is not universal. It's kind of my point with all this. So if you're looking at fairies or fairy-like beings in other areas and other cultures and other types of folklore, they may have very different rules of etiquette or expectations. And in some cases, they can be surprisingly similar, but in other cases, they can be very different. So you don't want to take this as if this is broadly true across the board of everything. And I know myself, I do sometimes have a bad tendency to sort of speak of it in as a generalization, because my main focus is the Irish and to the lesser degree the Scottish material. So, full disclosure on that one, this is much more specific to those cultures, and it does vary. So if you're looking in different areas, if you your personal focus is different fairy lore, different regions, different language, different culture, I really recommend focusing specifically on those and researching it yourself, or finding trusted sources that focus on those specifically, and not just taking this as blanket truths across the board for absolutely everyone. Although I will say that point number one, as we get into it, really is kind of true across the board for everything, but the others do vary. So that all said, this is also like the Cliff Notes version of fairy etiquette. This is not a full in-depth class or discussion. I'm not trying to teach people here, the finer points of fairy etiquette. It sounds like some sort of Victorian era, class for young people. That would be a much, much longer video than what I'm making today. This is just sort of the bullet points for people, so you have a rough idea when we talk about fairy etiquette, what it is we're talking about. And, to begin with, generally, politeness, good manners, the same sort of politeness and good manners that we would broadly expect across human cultures is what we would also want to apply to the good folk. Be generally respectful, don't go in with a nasty attitude, don't go in demanding things, don't go in acting like they owe you anything or that they are subservient to you in any way. Effectively, treat them or expect to treat them, as we see in stories, the way you would a strange or unknown human that you're meeting. who may or may not have power over your life. Someone who would outrank you, I guess, in human society. I refer to it as the grandmother manners. Like if you were going to visit your grandmother, how polite would you expect to be? Which will also, of course, vary across cultures, I assume. But just generally, be polite. Don't go in with a big attitude. Don't go in with a sense of entitlement. That is sort of where you want to start when it comes to these beings. Now, point number 2, which is one that does vary across different cultures, but is something that I find in a lot of the Celtic language material, the Irish and the Scottish material, and that I know a lot of other people who study this or are interested in this are familiar with, is the idea of not saying thank you. And this is an English language specific thing. And it seems to come down, no one knows exactly why this is a thing, I should say, but it seems to come down to the semantics of it all. The fair folk are huge about semantics, and in this particular case, the issue seems to be that if you go back, the term thank you, the phrase thank you in English, is sort of rooted in an idea of obligation. It is something that would be said by someone of lower rank to someone of greater rank when that person had done something for the lower ranking person that the lower ranking person was then obligated to reciprocate or was in the higher ranking person's debt for. So it initially is something that entered the language as a thing that lower ranking people would say to like lords, higher ranking people. Even though it's kind of lost that context a bit in English, in the 21st century, it still retains that semantic value. That is ultimately the meaning of what you're saying. Kind of like in Spanish, when you say adios to say goodbye, it's understood equivalently in English to mean goodbye, but you're literally saying to God. So even though the sort of figurative meaning has changed and is understood differently in 21st century culture, the literal ingrained semantic meaning is something else. And fairies, particularly in folklore and in anecdotal accounts, are huge for semantics. They will manipulate semantics to their advantage in pretty much any situation. So when you say thank you to them, the idea is, the way it's taken, is that you then are writing them a blank check, that you're acknowledging that you owe them, that you are obligated to repay them in some way, and that it's up to them to then decide how. So it's generally thought that you want to avoid saying thank you specifically. Now, you can express the same concept in other languages. For example, in Irish, you would say "Gromagit," which literally means goodness to you, or, like a blessing on you, effectively, goodness on you. That would be perfectly fine to say. Any expression that's sort of equivalent to that in English would be fine to say. Specifically, it's thank you. And again, no one knows exactly why or how this got started. This is something I've been familiar with pretty much for my entire life, at least since the late 80s or early 90s. But the general school of thoughts that go around are either that it's acknowledging an obligation to them, or that it offends them in some sense, because it's sort of dismissive, thank you and move on. Either way, etiquette-wise, it's generally considered a no-no. You just don't say thank you to them. Another big thing when it comes to etiquette around the fair folk relates to cleanliness. This might be a strange thing to include under etiquette, but it's an important one, and it does get into how we interact with them. The fair folk across the board, this is Celtic language speaking, and this also gets into the Norse material, really abhor filth, excrement, anything along those lines. And there's many, many, many stories in folklore and fairy lore of them being deeply offended by things like dirty standing water, urine, excrement, human or animals, And so the idea is, if you're interacting with them, if you're dealing with them, if you're, reading about them in stories, you will expect that they have this expectation of cleanliness. They do not like dirty homes. They don't like dirty people, basically. They don't like waste that's being left around. One of the ways to ward against them, to protect against them and keep them away, is to use things like urine, human urine, or animal excrement, because they will not get anywhere near that. So when it comes to etiquette and dealing with them, this is important to remember. And this is true in the Irish and the Scottish, but I'm going to use a Norse example here because it just illustrates it really well. There's an expression, this is in Iceland, for urination, which is called driving out the elves, because the belief is, if you pee outdoors, that you are so offending whatever alpha or whatever elves might be around that they will leave the area. So this gets into the etiquette in the sense of, if you are out and about and potentially interacting with them or in their places, don't do things like that. Be very conscious and aware of sort of bodily waste because it will offend them, and that is definitely an etiquette issue, in my opinion. Another thing that we sort of see that's a big important thing with the etiquette with them is the idea of reciprocity. If you feel they've done something for you, you definitely want to pay them back in some way, do something for them. If you would like them to do something for you, I don't really encourage people to go in that direction, but if you are, keep in mind that you need to do something in return. We see this in the stories, particularly with the idea of, if your house has a brownie, you want to make sure you give them milk or, sweet cakes or something once a week, because that is the expectation, that is the repayment for what they are doing. It's not payment in the sort of modern capitalist sense. It's reciprocity. It's they're doing something for you, so you do something for them. And, we see that across different strata of folk belief. And that, again, in my opinion, gets into the idea of the etiquette, that everything is about balance. And if a thing is being done for you, you make sure that you reciprocate. If you do a thing for them, there's generally an understanding that there will be reciprocation. Just keep in mind that that can be dangerous territory. If you do a thing that they judge as positive, something positive will come from it. If you do a thing that they consider to be negative or that they don't want, then the result will be negative for you. So it's sort of a risky business there. And we see that, for example, in the story of Lushmore, where, this is a man who had a hunchback, and he falls asleep on a fairy hill, wakes to hear them singing, realizes that he can add the next verse to the song, waits until the perfect moment to do so. The fairies are thrilled because he's given them a new verse and it was perfect timing. He didn't interrupt, so they heal him. Someone else who has a similar affliction hears the story, goes and decides to get the same cure for himself. But he's impatient. He doesn't wait until the proper time in the song, just kind of busts in and yells out what the next verse would be. And the fairies are offended by that. And so they punish him. And instead of taking away his affliction, they make it twice as bad. So definitely reciprocity going on there. But something to keep in mind that, you're taking a risk anytime you're going to make that attempt. That if they don't like what you're doing or they don't appreciate it, the response, you will get a response. They will pay it back, so to speak, but you may not like the results. So those are just 4 quick sort of etiquette points when it comes to the fair folk. Another thing I'll add, just sort of briefly, when it gets into fairy etiquette, it's usually considered a well-established fact, again in the Celtic language-speaking cultures, that the Fae folk really strictly guard their privacy. They do not like being seen. They do not really like people bragging about encounters with them, positive encounters with them. They sort of have a very ingrained sense of privacy. Sometimes this is perceived as secrecy, but I think privacy is a better word for it. Catherine Briggs discusses this a lot in her work. So this is sort of something to keep in mind. If you are reading about them or looking at anecdotal accounts or potentially interacting with them yourself, just keep in mind that, again, sort of using the same measuring stick you might use when dealing with other humans, if you stumble across someone else having like a party in their backyard, don't necessarily stand at the fence and start yelling about the party that you're seeing, or just invite yourself in, because both of those things would clearly be rude. And that applies just as much if we're talking about otherworldly beings as humans. You have to be invited in. You can't just interrupt it. And just like I assume if you're having a party, you wouldn't appreciate someone standing outside very loudly yelling about it, or narrating the events or what have you, being watched, if you will, filming it, whatever. The same sort of applies in that context to the good folk. They don't appreciate feeling like they're being spied on or observed against their will or any of that. So, there's usually sort of a advice that goes around that if you see them and it seems like they don't see you, to pretend that you don't see them. Particularly with the types of fairies that can be more dangerous, it's often suggested that you just continue going about your business and don't acknowledge that you can see them. If you see them and they're annoyed that you're seeing them, they have a tendency, for example, to blind people, things like that. So probably definitely include that under etiquette points as well. But that's sort of the quick etiquette tips I have for you today. Again, we could do an entire hour or 2 hour long class on, proper etiquette with the good folk. But these tips are a good start and give you, I hope, a good idea of the basics and of sort of where things stand with the good folk. Honestly, if you can just consider approaching them pretty much the same way you would consider approaching strange humans that you don't know, that's a good baseline to work from. Just remember the don't say thank you thing. Usually with the Celtic cultural fairies, it's considered unwise to eat or drink food that's offered to you. You'll be trapped in fairy. With the Norse cultural fairies, you're actually worse off if you refuse food and drink, because that's considered rude. So again, cultural context really matters. Keep that in mind. You're going to have to study a lot of different material to kind of get a feel for how things work in different contexts with different groups, different regions, different folklore, and all of that. So hopefully, though, this is a good start for the day. Gives you some idea of how this all works. And any questions, pop them in the comments, and I will continue trying to work through my list here and my additional items coming in from the comments. So have a great day, everyone.